Welcome to the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast. Hi, I'm David Manti, and welcome to a new episode of the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast. With me this week is Jessica Tonani, CEO of Verda Bio. Thank you very much for joining me today, Jessica.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. It's my pleasure. Before we get started, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. You can also help us out a lot by leaving the podcast a positive review on whatever platform you use. You can also email the podcast. You can reach me at David@Cannabis Equipment News with email the podcast in the subject line. You can also subscribe to our daily newsletter. Make sure you get the podcast delivered to your inbox first. Jessica, thanks again for joining me. I really do appreciate it. I'd like to learn a little bit about you personally before we get into the business side of things. How did you find yourself in the cannabis industry?
That's a good question. I came from really traditional biotech background. So I worked in genomic analysis for about 20 years, different technologies, and I found myself sick. Long story short is I came to cannabis as a medical patient, and I really realized that it is a great medicinal plant, but it's really hard to navigate from a patient's perspective. So I convinced some friends to start a biotech, and with our goal of enabling patients to navigate a little bit better, making a little bit more consistent products that potentially have some steps around them on how patients should use them and what they might expect. And so that's how I got to it, I guess, is through the medical route.
What were some of the issues you were having when it came to the cannabis available on the market? Was it inconsistency, quality concerns?
Yeah, it was. And this was, 15 years ago in the Washington medical market. And I think that, things have definitely changed in the last 15 years, especially in some of the more established states. But I think, one of the biggest issues that I saw was really helping other patients. So you would tell them, go and buy this product, and it would work one time for them. And then the next week when they would go to purchase it, it would be very inconsistent in the results. And I think it was a really frustrating experience for a lot of patients. And so we thought, if we stabilize the plant genetics, they would create consistent products and people could utilize those consistent products for consistent results, be them either recreational, wellness, or medicinal uses.
Are you still a medicinal user?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I definitely am.
Okay. I don't want to dig too deep, but was it something life-threatening that you were faced with?
Yeah, it was actually. And I was essentially what happened is my stomach kind of quit working, and I had to have some surgery. It involved a clinical trial. Clinical trials are difficult to get funded and hard to get into. And so while I was biding time for the clinical trial, I was essentially wasting away. I was about 60 pounds less than I am now. I was pretty sick. And so I turned to cannabis for nausea. And, the reality is nausea is a very easy indication to find efficacy for in cannabis, but I kind of through there came to know a lot more patients that have more difficult challenges. Nausea is not a very difficult thing to address with cannabis in my mind, but there's definitely more challenges out there. So definitely still a medical user. I think everything that we do from our company's perspective is in the thought that there could be somebody using this medically at the end of the day. But, even recreationally, whatever people are using, I think people want a consistent experience.
So when did you found Verda Bio, and what has it been like ever since you came to the market?
Yes. So we founded 9 years ago, roughly. It was a bit of a rough road. Washington State had just legalized cannabis, and we wanted to do a research company around it. And so we went, we downloaded all the paperwork, started to fill it out. And what we have in the state of Washington is a producer license, a grower, and they're called producers here. And so we filled out the producer license paperwork, and there was a couple questions we couldn't figure out how to answer. So we went to our liquor cannabis board, the regulatory agency here, and we said, how do we fill out this paperwork? And they said, you don't. You can only grow cannabis to destroy or sell in the state of Washington, not to research. So it took us about 4 years to change the law. We got the first cannabis research license issued by a state in the country about 5 years ago. And, it's an interesting market. I think it's, I tell all my friends, it's a market where you have one arm tied behind your back at all times. You never know, like banking, you can't take for granted. You can't take your suppliers for granted. You can't take anything for granted. And everything you do has a huge operating cost associated with it. We in the state have to at all times show everybody's everything from their head to their toes on all cameras. It's a lot to operate, but we do it, and I've really enjoyed it, actually.
Did it make it easier because you're passionate about the product to sort of jump through all of those hoops?
Yeah, I think that a lot of people, quite frankly, there was about a dozen of us that started. We were the first and only ones to get the license. Since then, another license has come on board. But, the fact that the state of Washington has been around now legal for 10 years and only has 2 research licenses is kind of an indication that you got to have some will other than just wanting to do a business around it, I guess.
How did you change the law?
That's a good question. I am a science major, not a history major. And so when they said you need to change the law, I said, how do I do that? Your exact question. And they said, here's the name of 2 senators. Maybe they'll help you. And so we had a Republican and a Democrat senator. I cold called them and said, this is what we want to do. And they both walked me through it. When you change a law, there's a lot to it. You have to get both the House and the Senate to sign off, and you have to go through committees, and you have to get fiscal notes to it and all this fun stuff that now, unfortunately, I've gotten pretty familiar with. Our bill was the first bill in the state of Washington to pass unanimously around cannabis. Everything else always has, outliers in the vote. Right. We got all the way through. We got to the governor's office desk, and he vetoed us because he vetoed every bill that year. We weren't dead. I thought we were dead, but it turns out that the Senate could override his veto, and they did. So it was a learning experience. If anybody needs help now with legislative law in this space, I've now been doing it for 7-8 years. And it seems like every year there's a different bill that we get involved with.
Well, that's incredible. I was going to ask, what laws are you changing next?
So in Washington, hemp and food is a big one. So allowing non-impairing cannabinoid products to be considered food ingredients, things like CBD, CBG. So we're working on that. I was on a task force this last essentially fall. We did a report, and we're working on that bill right now. There's a couple other bills that are going through. One is essentially to kind of set a threshold for which a product becomes a regulated product. So, containing so much of a compound that has the potential to get somebody high. We've gone back and forth on impairing and all other words. So now I just say potential to get high. Not very scientific. But those products, I think everybody kind of realizes that there's a threshold at which below, is probably hemp, above is probably a regulated product. And so there's 2 separate bills in the state of Washington right now going through. One is for our regulators that regulate high THC products, and the other is for the regulator that regulates food ingredients. So we've been working on those.
What part of the biotech industry were you in before founding Verda or Verda Bio?
I was in mostly the genomic space. So when I got out of grad school, I got into genomics was just starting. So Human Genome Project, molecular diagnostics, and that pretty quickly transitioned into plants. Most ag sciences were kind of the first to pick that up. Plants are interesting and nice because they have short life cycles in general. So you can, look at the genetics on 1 million plants a lot easier than looking at the genetics on 1 million people kind of thing. So that was the space I was in. Right before founding Verda Bio, I was involved in a spin out of Harvard where we used little emulsions to sequence DNA. So we built a DNA sequencer using droplets.
Okay.
Yeah, like deflated tires, and we would inflate them with everything we needed. There, it was pretty cool.
That's awesome. So, what work do you do at Verda Bio?
Everything. When you run a company, I think people, when they start a company, they think like, and I'm sure there are people that run companies that have like nice little, individual jobs. But I would say for a large part, I oversee like our scientific direction. We're a smaller company. So, yesterday I was planting clone plugs. Today I was kind of setting up what needed to be run on the HPLC. So, kind of anything that needs to be done. But I think for the most part, I help kind of set the strategic direction, make sure we have the resources that we need to get things done, and, move anything that needs to be done in the company forward, whether it be take out the trash or plant a clone or, it's vacation time of the year. So we're short.
Understood. I feel like everyone's short right now in the business.
I mean, that's the thing, right? I mean, and you just do what you need to do. And the thing is that plants don't care, like plants don't care if it's Christmas or Thanksgiving or whatever. They want water, they want light, they want a human to be around. So
yeah. No, I have a new puppy. It's the same thing. Always with the food and the outside. My goodness.
I know. Multiply that by we don't have that many plants going on right now. We probably have about 500 plants and about 2,000 seedlings. We do a lot of seedlings. We have some methods that we can test seedlings to figure out whether they're going to potentially make the plants we want them to make. Mm-hmm. So we kill off about 90% of our seedlings. We're pretty mean that way.
It's a rough go for seedlings there.
It's super rough for seedlings.
So for your client base, at what stage of the process is your client typically at when they approach you?
Yeah. So we broke off into two companies about 4 or 5 years ago because of different regulatory rules. So we have a hemp company, and the hemp company, we work with farmers to scale production and growth of hemp. So we generally production we start kind of planning this right around now. Seedlings usually go into the greenhouses May, into the ground June. If we direct seed, generally like first week of June. And so right now we're planning our university trials and looking at like planning with our commercial partners. We generally plant about 200,000 hemp seeds a year. And then we have on that side, we have a consumer product good company. And those consumers, if they can find Basic Jane, they approach us, at any point. And generally it's just to purchase a product. Sometimes it's a question. On the high THC side, we're a really closed system. So on that side, we're really selectively breeding for traits that we think have medicinal or wellness purposes, certain cannabinoids. And we actually, none of those are commercial yet. We're all in research, selecting for the plants, stabilizing those traits, and beginning to do research on those products. So that's a pretty closed loop system over there.
One thing that I found interesting on the website was that you've built this proprietary cannabis plant library.
Yeah.
How did the company go about creating that, and why?
So we went about creating it because we really wanted to do clinical research on plants. And the reality is, if you do clinical research on plants, the cannabis plant's only meant to grow or live like 9 months, right? Mm-hmm. So we would take it, and we felt like this clonal propagation, the plants degrade. They get metagenomic changes, their chromosomes shorten, their telomeres, they're not the same plant. And it's this, loss in vigor is kind of what you hear in the industry. And it's really, they just get old. We're cloning off of a 90-year-old plant and expecting it to act like a 20-year-old, right? So what we thought was we need to have it come from the seed. We need to stabilize the seed so that when you put a seed in the ground, it'll be the same seed. And that means we can refresh the genetics. That takes about 8 years. And so what we did was we just started building it. We thought, these are the plants we believe that we're going to need. Let's just start selectively breeding for those plants. And so for the last, several years, we turn and burn seedlings. We select plants, we breed them, we then throw them back in the ground, and we have this continuously going on and on and on in our facility. And right now we have the seeds that are coming off right now are THCV. They'll be coming off in about a week. The seedlings that are going to replace those are actually powdery mildew resistant THC. So we just have these traits we breed for and just cycle them through the facility.
How do you deal with the ebb and flow of success and failure, especially on the research side of things? I have to imagine that it's sometimes a high failure rate.
It is, sometimes we'll think that we have a seed, and seed breeding takes like 4 months at least. You gotta get the plants to probably closer to 5 or 6. We have to get the seedlings to the point that they're in a veg state so that we can, turn the lights on them, and then it's post-pollination a good 2 months till you actually have a mature seed. And so it's a flipping of the lights. And sometimes we'll think, hey, we're going to do these. We're going to get these plants out. We're going to get plants that produce, CBG, let's say. And then next thing we know, it's CBD again. But inversely, we have equal things. For example, we thought we were breeding 6 months ago for CBDV. We ended up with CBGV, which is a really fun, interesting compound. So, the mistakes go each way, I guess I would say, is that, sometimes there's good mistakes and sometimes there's bad mistakes.
Yeah.
Yeah. We like to call them the good mistakes, luxury problems. We want luxury problems.
I like luxury problems a lot better than happy accidents.
Yeah, right. So we are constantly looking for luxury problems at our office.
Oh man, that has to be like the title of the memoir. So why is it important to sequence hemp plant genomes?
Yeah, so I think that for us it's important to understand the plant. And, quite frankly, the genomics is interesting to us right now, and we do it, but we find much higher quality data off of analytics of metabolites. So for example, right now we do a decent amount of genomic work, but we find the metabolite, if we're going to, for example, look at THC or CBD or, any of the cannabinoids, looking at those actual cannabinoid levels is more valuable to us right now than the genomic sequence back end. And it just has to do with how complex those genes are. So we do it, but we actually make kill, no kill decisions off of looking at the actual metabolites themselves.
Okay. Do you find it particularly exciting that there's so many unknowns when it comes to the cannabinoids?
Yeah, I do. And I think that everybody knows the plant for THC and CBD, which are great molecules, have their purpose, but there's other ones that I'm really excited about. So for example, THCV from an appetite suppression perspective, if that data holds true, that, that could significantly impact both wellness and health. So if you think about all, a lot of the issues associated with obesity, if you could decrease those scenarios, you could really improve human health. And, the question is whether or not THCV holds up to that. But, we have a treasure trove of molecules in, CBG A with the antiviral work that Oregon State did, if that holds up, I don't know if this data will actually hold up, but if it does, those markets could, have much higher impacts on humans in general than, THC or CBD probably ever will. Although they're awesome molecules.
That's one of the things I like the most about talking to people on the research side of things is how there's so much unlocked potential in the plants, and you guys seem to be like right on the front lines of that emerging tech.
Yeah, we are, and it's really fun. I mean, I always tell people, like, I don't want to diss like CBD or THC. They're great molecules. We research them, we do it. But at the end of the day, I think, in 20, 30 years, we're going to be thinking like those are good molecules, but they're not the best molecules the plant's made.
Remember when we just did THC? Crazy.
Right. I know. It's funny because I remember we started breeding for CBD like 5-6 years ago, and we got a clipping of an ACDC, and that plant, it was probably like where we got it from or something, but the leaves were so yellow, we could not make that plant live. Like, it was so horrible. Finally, we were like, you know what? We're just going to take a THC plant with a little CBD, because they all had a little CBD in them at the time, and selectively breed. And that's how we got our CBD varietals, is from THC plants. But yeah, it used to be hard to find CBD and CBD plants that grew well.
What was the antiviral work that you were referencing from Oregon State?
Oregon State University did some really interesting like cell culture work on COVID, and they showed that CBGA and CBDA, the acid forms, delay the uptake of the virus into the cells. Oh. And so, it's all tissue culture work. I'm not advocating to go like purchase it and, expose yourself or anything, but it is probably some of the most promising antiviral work I've seen in a long time. And I think that there are some groups that are, continuing that work forward to actually figure out, if it holds true. But, if it does, I think viruses, for example, are something that are going to continue to plague us, be it, SARS viruses or other viruses. And if we can prevent uptake, that's could have significant impact on human health long term.
No, I do. I like how you keep mentioning if it proves out, because it's, I think sometimes in this industry, people will read the introduction to the study and just be like, all right, green light it. Yeah.
And it's such an interesting market because from a medical perspective, it's really been inversed. In general, like, patients go to the doctor and they say, like, what drugs should I take? And then the doctor's like, here's your antacid or whatever it is. Yeah. And you take it, right? But for this, a lot of patients came to cannabis as a last path, not like as a first line therapy. Right. And everything else failed for them. And they went and they used these products. And if you look at like the Dravet scenario with CBD, those parents didn't have any other option. And they really kind of like flipped the science paradigm upside down by saying, we're going to try this. And, oh, by the way, it worked. And, oh, by the way, doctors, now you have to accept it. So, it is a plant that has shown like this inverse clinical development, but I think we need to be careful in how much we push that inverse clinical development, because they're not all going to be, the Dravet story.
Right. They're not all going to be winners.
Yeah, exactly.
Getting back to Verda Bio. So I believe it was in May 2021, at least according to my notes, you won this competition from Agilent Technologies. Can you tell me a little bit about the competition? And I think as a result, you won an Agilent, a 1260 Infinity 2 LC system for potency testing, which obviously I know everything about because I read it. But so could you tell me a little bit about this competition that you won, the system, and how you're using it?
Yeah, you bet. So it was one of these things that we saw an ad, just, like for actually it might have been years. Some podcasts like sent us an email and we were like, oh, click through. And it was a piece of equipment that we really wanted, and it's not inexpensive. We had been sending out potency testing is generally sent out to other labs. And the issue with that is it generally takes about a week turnaround time. And from a plant breeding perspective, that is a disadvantage. You kind of have to know when to harvest. You want to be able to do a lot of different testing along the development cycle. And that delay in sending out samples was costly, but the price of the equipment was overwhelming for us. So we literally had everybody in the office enter it. My co-founder, who's a clinical research nurse, apparently maybe wrote like the best paragraph.
Nice.
And so we were selected, we won it, and we got it installed. And what it does is it allows us to be able to look at cannabinoids quantitatively, and fairly quickly. It takes about 10 minutes a sample. And so we can load up samples. What we'll do is, depending on the application, for example, for hemp field testing, we, look at hemp plants every couple of days because that 0.3 threshold is critical. And so we'll just sample plants and, bring them in and test them. From like an R&D development perspective, we will be able to look at like yields of the plants and also overall profiles. So we'll be able to say, does this plant produce CBD or THC or CBG, whatever it is, and at how much does it produce, which is critical because you could have a plant that you think is producing, let's say, for example, a lot of THC. And if you look at like the regulated THC markets, the difference between a 15% THC plant and a 23, 24% THC plant is, does your product sell?
Right.
And so being able to know, this is a plant that has commercial utility, or this is a plant that we like the look of it, but probably isn't commercially viable, is important to us.
Okay. I think it's interesting. First of all, that advertising for this campaign works. So, for marketing inquiries. No, but you had mentioned turnaround issues with labs. We've also heard about issues with inconsistency. Were those some of the experiences you had until you brought this in-house?
Yeah, it definitely was. And, one of the things is that this market, most states, every state has to build their testing systems, state by state. And, the issue is that in general lab testing markets, there are government regulatory agencies that blindly test these labs and make sure that they get consistent results. Those are federally funded. States aren't used to setting that up. California and New York, I think, are the only states that have, for molecular diagnostics, those systems set up. So when you look at like a state like Washington, all of our lab testing is certified, but it's not necessarily consistent. And so I tell people, it's like, if you were to say to a hospital, hey, guess what? You can report out whatever you want for cholesterol levels. We'll never audit you. That hospital is most likely going to give you high cholesterol results. So you keep going back to your doctor. Right. And in the cannabis testing market, if you're growing high THC product, they're going to inflate those numbers oftentimes. If you tell them you're growing hemp, they're going to deflate that THC number. And there's not a lot of checks and balances because every state is having to do something that they're really not used to having to do. But there are some very good labs out there. We self-audited labs in Washington, and there were two that we routinely were sending samples to and were happy with. There were other ones that we were pretty confident that the results that they were giving may not be accurate.
Right. Varied a bit.
Varied. And one of the key things I tell regulators is look at their equipment and look at how many samples they theoretically can run a day, and look at how many samples they're saying they run a day. Okay. And if they're running more samples than they theoretically should be, like there's a problem.
Are there any other than consistency, turnaround time, are there any other benefits to having the HPLC in house? And is there any other equipment that you can't live without?
Yeah. So for us, there is, in the sense that generally labs run, a standard cannabinoid testing panel, and those are generally 11 cannabinoids. We're interested in some of these rare things. We're interested in CBGV, for example. That's not found on any standard panel. And so for us, being able to actually look at those rare cannabinoids ourselves, where other labs would not be able to actually even tell us what they were, is valuable.
Right.
Really valuable. And, from other lab testing equipment, we use a lot of thermocyclers. So PCR is important to us. Scales are invaluable, like a good scale. I would say like top of the list of what you need in a cannabis testing lab. And then from an equipment perspective, we use a lot of other, pipette men, just kind of standard lab tools. But I would say for us, we do a lot of thin layer chromatography, a lot of HPLC, and a lot of PCR in our lab. So equipment is thermocyclers, pipette men, good scales, HPLC.
The importance of the scale.
The scale, a good scale, because the problem with especially like an HPLC, like an analytical equipment, is if your scale's off, you compound that error through the entire situation. So if you're off 4 or 5%, then your numbers at the end of the day are off 4 or 5% on the cannabinoid. It's a lot.
Talking about the inconsistency and the variability of the plants, will it ever be possible to have absolute control over plant variability?
So there's always going to be kind of genes and environment. But what I would say is, if you look at other agricultural crops, if you look at something like a wheat or hops or, cherries, if you go and walk those fields, you'll see, although there's, maybe 1% or 2 variable plants, generally they're really consistent. And that has to do with the fact that the overall environment of where they're being grown is consistent, and that the genetics of the seed are consistent, or the rhizome, or whatever they're started from. So, I think it is a world in which we can make seeds that, if they're grown in a similar environment, will produce the same thing. If you take those seeds and grow them in a different environment, they will grow differently. And that's just, I tell people, it's like if you took 2 twins and took one of them and only fed it Whole Foods, and then you took another and only fed it McDonald's, people are going to look different. The plants are the same. Yeah.
The one in McDonald's is going to be better off, right?
Right. Totally better off. What is that movie? I forget the name of that movie.
Super Size Me.
Yeah. Super Size Me.
It's terrible, but there's never been a movie that has made me crave French fries more than that movie.
Right. They're so delicious.
I was just like, I understand everything they're preaching here. I'm going to go get a large fry.
Can I supersize that?
Exactly. So the other part of the business that you had mentioned was Basic Jane.
Yeah.
When did you launch Basic Jane, and how did you make that decision to kind of get on the commercial side of the business?
Yeah, so we launched Basic Jane about 6 years ago, commercially about 5. And the reason that we did it was we were playing around with some product formulations, and my friend's, my co-founder's mom was using them, and she was like, I love these products. And she had a large network of friends, and they started, next thing we knew, it was like, hey, and by the way, I need 20 of those creams or whatever. And we were like, yeah, no, we can't, like, we're not a commercial company. And so we just kind of stepped back and said, people want these products, so we will manufacture and produce them. We'll make sure that we use consistent ingredients and formulate them with the idea that our families are using them. And So it just kind of ballooned from there. It essentially was, my co-founder's mom had too many friends that wanted the product, and so we launched.
That's fantastic. Do you do the manufacturing in-house?
Yeah. So we're in a large building actually here. I tell people anytime, as long as you're 21 and not crazy, we'll give you a tour. But the facility that we're in has the largest or one of the largest commercial kitchens for edibles in the state. And we have a full production manufacturing facility. So about 90% of the products we manufacture here, there are one or two that we actually outsource for different equipment reasons. But no, we have a GMP facility that does manufactures here.
Were there difficulties getting into an entirely different side of the business, launching Basic Jane?
Yeah, there was. And especially right around that time, when we look at cannabis plants, when we first started, a cannabis plant is a cannabis plant. Like if it makes THC, we didn't really care if it made THC or not. Like we were interested in that component of it for breeding, but it wasn't something that we were like, if this plant does not make THC, it can't be grown in this regulated facility. And there became a time when the hemp farm bill passed here in the US and then the state of Washington, that there were two different regulatory agencies, our Department of Ag and our Liquor Cannabis Board. And we were essentially told you can't grow hemp in a cannabis facility. So at that point we knew we had to break the business. So long story short, a bunch of things kind of came together where we said, hey, this hemp market has some legs. We can do commercial products. We can, do banking. It's a normal business. And then we have this cannabis side and it made sense to actually break them into two completely separate entities, separate offices, separate, everything at that point. But it was a big jump for us.
So Basic Jane's been around 5 years or so now. Has it continued to grow over the years?
Yeah, it really has. The one thing that I will say is that we got hit with the pandemic, I think, like everyone else. And the thing that really affected us was we were in a lot of small boutiques and things, and they all closed. So we went for 6 months without a wholesale order, which was it was brutal. And so we're just now seeing our wholesale customers pick back up. And so we had to really pivot. I think like a lot of consumer product companies, we had to figure out how do we actually touch the individual customers versus how do we sell to a store that touches those customers.
So did you invest in a lot of e-commerce?
We did. And we just really went out and started talking to everybody and sharing the word. And, it's really difficult to actually reach customers, I think, at the end of the day. But we have a really high reorder rate, north of 65%. So once we get a customer, we know we have a product they love. So it's really about how do we get a new customer? And most of that's word of mouth still.
Yeah. You just need the associate's mother to throw Basic Jane parties.
Right. I know. We are setting up an affiliate program now. And I've said, Joanne, you need to become an affiliate.
It makes sense. Get on it, Joanne.
Yeah. She's like, well, dear, I just tell everyone I love it.
That's the best salesperson right there.
Right.
Absolute belief in the product.
Yeah. Right.
So one of the things that I noticed on the website for Verda was that you're looking for strategic collaborations. What are you looking for in a strategic collaboration in cannabis?
So several things. So one is clinical networks to clinical research. That is really difficult in this space. And so we are constantly working and talking with people how do we actually set up and run clinical research projects so that we can figure out what do these cannabinoids do and what is, what claims can be made and how do you back up those claims with research? So I would say anybody with clinical interest in clinical research, we're super interested in. We also are interested in kind of grower networks. So, for example, plants that we think have recreational or wellness attributes, we're just starting to actually license those out, the seeds. So we're definitely interested in those collaborations. And, it's an immature space. I mean, we partner with people on nutrient regimens, lights. If you want something kind of controlled that you think we'd be interested in, we're always willing to talk. And maybe it's not of interest for both of us, and it's 15 minutes out of our life that we are nice to meet you. But in general, we're open.
Yeah, just one of those conversations where it's like, nice person, not going to work out.
We don't have anything. One of the biggest issues being in Washington is that we're super progressive state on legalizing cannabis, but we still have rules from 10 years ago. So things like actual clinical research, working with universities is pretty much prohibited here. And so, more states that have come online later, Ohio, Pennsylvania, those are really of interest to us. And we do work in those on more clinical research because their universities have the ability to do it. We're working off of memorandums that were written off of the Cole memo. So, all our universities are still scared of losing their federal money, which is kind of a joke with the amount of cannabis we sell.
Right. Understood.
We sell billions and still have our roads. So I think we're okay.
You had mentioned there was a team of 12 or so of you that started Verda Bio. Did the team remain intact over the years?
Yeah, so there were 4 founders, and we completely have stayed intact. So the founders were myself, a clinical research nurse, a marketing guy, and a lawyer, which is really, I think, core what you need in cannabis, especially the lawyer component. Early days. I think things are a lot easier now, but 9-10 years ago, I think I had about half my friend group tell me I was completely insane for even thinking about doing cannabis research.
But at some point, they finally turned and, 4 or 5 years down, they're like, you know what? Really didn't believe in you, but you nailed it.
Well, and hilariously, now, some of them are founding their own companies in the space. Oh. So I'm like, late adopter, it's okay.
That's right. You're the pioneer.
Yeah, we got a lot of bruises from that.
When it comes to the research side of things, is it easier to work state to state, or I don't want to say interstate commerce, but work across state lines on a research level than it is trying to get a product or plants across state lines?
Yeah, definitely, because research oftentimes doesn't require the actual physical plant. So, for example, we've worked with groups like Argonne National Labs or, Baylor, different groups on genomic material. So we can isolate the DNA here in our facility. And once it's just DNA, it's 100% legal. So, we can grow a plant, we can isolate the DNA, and then we can send it to, Argonne National Labs. We did the cannabis microbiome project with them. So what bacteria is naturally on cannabis? Turns out it's generally the, people's bacteria. Turns out we touch it a lot.
Yeah.
But, things like that. So the research, a lot of it's not just sending the plants, or, it isn't sending plants, which makes it substantially easier to do. You can send data, you can send nucleic acids, you can send different materials that you can research.
Well, I really appreciate all the time that you spent with me today. Before we get out of here, I just want to make sure, is there anything that we missed or potentially left out about Verda Bio or Basic Jane that you want to make sure the Cannabis Equipment News audience knows?
Yeah, I would just say that, we are women owned. We are really focused on research, and we're always open to talking to people about how we might be able to help, especially medical patients. We're always open to like ideas on, hey, we think this cannabinoid may be interesting. Can you start breeding for it? It takes us about 4 to 6 years to get a cannabinoid stable and at a high level. So if there's something that a disease group is interested in having, we need to know so we can start it, because it's going to be a while until they have it.
No, that's a really good point. When you talk about being women owned, do you think it's easier or not easier? Do you think the cannabis industry is more accepting of a women owned business than other traditional industries like food and beverage or manufacturing?
I would say 5 years ago, yes. 5 years ago, Entrepreneur did a really good piece. We were in it on, the women CEOs in cannabis. And I would say we're the only ones left in the whole article. Cannabis got really commercialized, and a lot of women in high spaces got squeezed out. So I think historically it was substantially easier. I think that's being shifted a little bit. But I would still say, like, go out on a limb. If you're a woman and you're interested in this space, just charge ahead. You can do it.
Right? Proof right here. Well, Jessica, again, thank you for lending your expertise. I really did find it enlightening. Some of the aspects of the industry that I have just not talked about before when it comes to the genomics, stuff like that.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate it. And, if you ever want to have us back for anything, just, ping me.
Oh, 100%. Permanent invitation.
Well, I appreciate it.
Excellent. Well, I got to do the housekeeping. Can't forget that. Before we get out of here, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. You can also help us out a lot by leaving the podcast a positive review on whatever platform you use. If you want to email the podcast, you can reach me at David@Cannabis Equipment News with email the podcast in the subject line. And make sure to subscribe to our daily newsletter. Get it delivered to your inbox first. Jessica, I didn't ask about contact information. Is there a place that people should reach out in the event that they want more info from Verda?
You bet. They can either email info@verdabio.com or info@basicjane.com. Either one, just say for Jessica and it will come my way.
Perfect. Looking for those strategic collaborations.
Definitely.
For Jessica Tonani, CEO of Verda Bio, I'm David Manti. This is the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast.